Hello again, 102. In this video, I'm going to go over the last question for Chapter 26. I'm going to skip the criticism of post-war American society. I'm going to save that for last. And I'm going to go over the goals, strategies, and impact of the civil rights movement of the 1950s. And this will be in two parts. And Eisenhower and race. Under the Jim Crow system, as we've been talking about, in southern states, they still risked being lynched if they registered to vote, and they're forced to use segregated facilities in all these different public areas. And they also are forced to attend segregated schools. In the North, discrimination was not as official, but it was equally real, as we saw in housing and in some types of employment. During the 1950s, the ongoing tragedy of race relations in the United States often offered President Eisenhower an opportunity to exercise transformational leadership. His unwillingness to do so was his greatest failure. And two aspects of Eisenhower's political philosophy limited his commitment to racial equality: his preference for state or local action over federal involvement, and his doubt that laws could change attitudes. I don't believe you can change the hearts of men with laws or decisions, he insisted. His passive attitude towards racial issues meant that government leadership on civil rights would come from the judiciary more than from the executive or legislative branch. And in 1953, Eisenhower appointed former Republican Governor Earl Warren of California as Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, a decision he later said was the biggest damn fool mistake I ever made. Warren, who had seemed safely conservative while in elective office, remember, he's the man who enforced Korematsu and the forced internment of Japanese Americans during the Second World War, and perhaps he felt some guilt about that once he got on the bench on the court, because he displayed a social conscience and a streak of libertarianism that was shared by another Eisenhower appointee to the court, William J. Brennan Jr. from New Jersey. Under Warren's leadership from 1953 through 1969, the Supreme Court became one of the most powerful forces for social and political change through the 1960s. Because separate but equal is obviously unequal. It's obvious in the post-war era. This is a water-cooled, nice, cool water, while this fountain over here is connected to it strictly by a piece of pipe. It's just rudimentary, that is all. African Americans will engage in much activism in the 1950s. Rural and urban, young and old, male and female, courageous blacks led what would become the most important social movement in 20th century American history. With brilliance, bravery, and dignity, they fought on all fronts, in the courts, at the ballot box, and in the streets, against the deeply entrenched system of racial segregation and discrimination. The Plessy decision from the Supreme Court in 1896 established the separate but equal principle that formed the basis for legal racial segregation. And the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People will use legal efforts to challenge the separate but equal system. Yet it took almost 15 years to convince the courts that racial segregation must end. Finally, in Sweat versus Painter in 1950, the Supreme Court ruled that a separate black law school in Texas was not equal in quality to the state's whites-only schools. The court ordered that the state remedy the situation, and it was the first step toward dismantling America's tradition of racial segregation. The Brown decision, in the landmark U.S. Supreme Court case that struck down racial segregation in public schools and declared separate but equal unconstitutional, this was the first one listed in a series of states that were challenging segregation in education. And since the Topeka, Kansas one was listed first, it became known with this court case decision. Warren wrote the path-breaking opinion himself, handed down on May 17, 1954, in which a unanimous court declared that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. And this is going to be Selma, Alabama, 10 years later, 11 years later, and still nothing has been done to remedy the appalling differences in facilities that African Americans are facing in trying to get their educations. I mean, there's not even any roof on this building. 10 years after the decision, Eisenhower refused to endorse or enforce the court's ruling. Privately, he grumbled that the Supreme Court decision set back progress in the South at least 15 years. Anyone who thinks you can do these things by force is just plain nuts, he said. While token racial integration began as early as 1954 in Kentucky and Missouri, hostility mounted in the lower South, the Gulf states, and Virginia. The Alabama State Senate and the Virginia legislature both passed resolutions nullifying the court's decision. We're back to the early 19th century, ladies and gentlemen, with this idea of nullification. Opponents of court-ordered integration of schools and other public places were defiant, and in 1956, 101 members of Congress signed a Declaration of Constitutional Principles called the Southern Manifesto, denouncing the Supreme Court decision in Brown as a clear abuse of judicial power that had created an explosive and dangerous condition in the South. Only 3 Southern Democrats in the Congress refused to sign. One of them, Senator Lyndon Baines Johnson of Texas, would become president 7 years later. In 6 Southern states by the end of 1956, 2 years after the Brown ruling, not a single black child attended schools with whites. The boycott will be another tactic of the civil rights movement. And individual African Americans took great personal risks. For example, in Montgomery, Alabama, on December the 1st, 1955, Mrs. Rosa Parks, a 42-year-old black seamstress, civil rights activist, and secretary of the local NAACP chapter, refused to give up her seat on a city bus to a white man. Like many Southern communities, Montgomery, the cradle of the Confederacy, required blacks to sit in the rear seats of buses or trains. Parks, however, was tired of giving in to the humiliating practice. Police then arrested her, and the boycott then developed of the bus system in Montgomery after she was arrested, because 75% of the city's riders were African Americans. And this is Mrs. Parks being booked, and there's Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who would be arrested 30 times in his life for defying racist laws. And this is going to be another tactic of the civil rights movement. And this boycott had a brave and charismatic leader. King was intelligent and courageous. To his foes, the self-controlled King warned, "We will soon wear you down by our capacity to suffer. And in winning our freedom, we will so appeal to your heart and conscience that we will win you in the process." And this is the huge tactic of the beginning civil rights movement, ladies and gentlemen, of defying unjust laws through peaceful actions. Non-violent civil disobedience will be championed by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And 381 days after the boycott began, they used carpools. People walked even though they got harassed by the KKK. They would ride horses to work, mules. Even sympathetic whites would give them rides. And eventually they won a federal case that eliminated racial segregation on the public buses. Also, the civic and business leaders of the downtown area in Montgomery got tired of losing business, and they also put pressure to end this practice. and the Supreme Court affirmed that separate but equal doctrine can no longer be safely followed as a correct statement of the law. And the next day, King and other African Americans boarded the buses. The success of the boycott showed that well-coordinated, nonviolent black activism could trigger major changes in public policy. And among African Americans, hope replaced resignation during the bus boycott, and action supplanted passivity. The boycott also catapulted King into the national spotlight. And what of Rosa Parks? She and her husband lost their jobs, and hate mail as well as death threats forced them to leave Alabama. They moved to Detroit, where they remained fully engaged in the evolving civil rights movement.